Good morning, everyone. It's so great to see so many folks joining us this morning for this really special opportunity we have today to speak with Dr. Vanessa M. Holden about her brand new and extraordinary book, Surviving Southampton, African-American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. I'm going to briefly introduce Dr. Hampton and then give her the floor. She's going to talk about her book and read a little bit about it as well, and also describe her research process. And I think Dr. Reed has told me that I've screwed up your name somehow. I apologize for that. Dr. Vanessa Holden. So let me reintroduce her, Dr. Vanessa M. Holden. Dr. Vanessa Holden received her PhD in African American and women's and gender history from Rutgers University. She currently has a dual appointment in both the Department of History and the program in African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky, and is the director of the Central Kentucky Slavery Initiative. And Dr. Holden is blessed with wonderful colleagues like my dear friend Nikki Brown, Anastasia Kerwood, and Devin Spence Benson, who recently joined her at Kentucky. Her research focuses on African-American women and slavery in the antebellum South. Her areas of interest are the histories of resistance and rebellion, gender history, and the history of sex and sexuality. She offers courses in American history, African-American history, and African-American studies. Dr. Holden's book, Surviving Southampton, African-American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community, was published by the University of Illinois Press in 2021. It explores the contributions that African-American women and children made to Nat Turner's Rebellion. Her writing has been published in Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Perspectives on History, Process, a blog for American history, and The Rumpus. She also blogs for Black Perspectives and The Junto, a group blog on early American history. Dr. Holden co-organizes the Queering Slavery Working Group, hashtag QSWG, on all of your social media, with Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Holden serves as a faculty advisor on a number of public history and digital humanities projects, including Freedom on the Move, a digital archive of runaway slave advertisements, and the Black Horsemen of Kentucky. We are so incredibly pleased to have Dr. Holden visit us today. Most of the people in the audience are in my African American women's history class, and we've been talking about you and preparing for your presentation to us for a number of weeks. We also have members of the community and other members of the ECSU community. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. Vanessa Holden.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm excited to speak with all of you, and I'm so happy this worked out for me to give a presentation. It's no longer Black History Month, but it is Women's History Month. So like I told my colleagues, happy to be here and happy to fit in with this year's programming. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book. I'm going to talk a lot about the how of my book. So not just the what's in it or what did I find, but how do I make the assertions that I make? How do I demonstrate the arguments that I make? And I'll also spend some time in the present. I was just in Southampton County last week to film for a project that I'm doing to hopefully develop a self-driving tour via cell phone application. And I spent a lot of time revisiting some of the spaces we'll talk about today in my presentation. And it was wonderful to be back in the county for the first time since 2019, since the before times of this current pandemic. It was wonderful to see both some colleagues from Christopher Newport University and also to spend some time with one of Nat Turner's descendants. I like to ground my work in descendant communities because I think often we talk about Black history as unknowable or as history that somehow no one knows and everyone's forgotten. But my answer to that is always, well, who doesn't know and who has forgotten? Because overwhelmingly Black people know our own history. We keep our own history and we preserve our own history. Do something a little out of the ordinary for historians. I'm going to read a little bit from my book for those of you who haven't picked it up yet and haven't had a chance to read it. I do that a couple times during today's presentation. I know most of the time that's perfectly fine, given the way that historians write, to not listen to us read from our work. But I like to give folks a sense of my prose style and a sense of the way that I present the work in writing. Because for me, if my books can't be picked up by folks who are just interested folks, folks like the folks I grew up around who spent time in local libraries and spent time educating their children about events that school wasn't going to cover. Unless it can be picked up by those folks, then my work isn't doing the work that I want it to. So let's get started. In July 2015, John Ricks, a retired U.S. Marine and Southampton County native, appeared at the county's monthly Board of Supervisors meeting. Amid public outcry at the county's monthly public outcry deriding the symbolism of Confederate relics and their complicated place in contemporary public spaces, Ricks came to confront Southampton's violent past. Instead of challenging the place of the county's monument to Confederate Army soldiers and veterans, Ricks had another marker of historical memory and violence in mind. Quote, "I draw my line with the naming of roads," he said. "I don't know who covers the naming of roads, but a month ago I was reading the Washington Post and it knocked my socks off, gentlemen. I was embarrassed because a paper we had a state writes an article explaining how Blackhead Signpost Road got its name. I'd heard this growing up, but I didn't want to believe it." If you travel to Southampton County today, you'll see that its history is written all over its landscape. Its main roads, now paved and marked with state highway labels or green street signs, often follow the routes that they followed in 1831. Many smaller roads in the southern half of the county, the area where most of the rebellion happened, take their names from important sites in the rebellion. Cabin Pond Road, Barrow Road, Porterhouse Road, and Cost Keys Road are part of everyday life in the county, imprinted on its Google map, on its street signs, and in the memory of its current residents. Along with these more benign sounding names was, until recently, a green street sign for Blackhead Signpost Road. William Sidney Drury, an early 20th century historian of the Southampton Rebellion and a Southampton native, described the origin of the place name thus, quote, "The head of one of the insurgents who had been shot was cut off and stuck on it. It was ever afterwards painted black as a warning against further outrage," end quote. At least one severed head was displayed at the crossroads, and when it decayed, the name continued to be used. Ricks said, quote, "I'm asking that Blackhead Signpost Road be changed. This is 2015. This is not 1860. I'm a scholar who's interested in freedom-making praxis. I'm interested in how enslaved people and enslaved women in particular made freedom for themselves. Enslaved people defined and made freedom in ways that historians often overlook. And the people who I care the most about looking at make freedom in ways that don't fit along a binary of people who were for slave rebellion and people who were against it. It doesn't work out quite so neatly when we talk about human beings. I also spend a lot of time in my work playing with the words surviving, survival, survivor, because it actually has multiple meanings in our language. And African Americans demonstrate each of those meanings in the history of this particular slave rebellion. So survivor is a word that we use for people who endure, for folks who survive a natural disaster, survive some sort of calamity in their life. But survivor is also a word that we use for the bereaved. It's to signifies grief in a very particular way. So if you ever read a funeral program or a death announcement or an obituary, it often lists a number of people by whom the deceased is survived. So it says something like John Doe survived by his wife of 15 years, his children, or a sister or another family member. So the Black communities of Southampton County were full of people who used both meaning, who lived both of those meanings. And Black women and children were integral to the labor of survival. So oftentimes, historians sort of shy away from thinking about survival because it sort of denotes a passive state, that something is just happening to enslaved people in the past, and they just sort of take it and endure, and somehow, make it through whatever calamity. But throughout my book, I demonstrate the ways that African Americans actually enact very particular practices, savvy strategies, and community networks to survive. That survival is actually a kind of labor. It's work to survive. It's not passive. It's a set of specific actions, and those actions are informed by deep community knowledge. They're not spontaneous. I want to start with the voice of an formerly enslaved person. So we're moving backwards in time from the present to a formerly enslaved person in the 1930s, and then we'll get to the voices of some enslaved people. In the summer of 1937, Susie R.C. Byrd, a worker for the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, which is a program that came about during the Great Depression that did a whole bunch of things, like employ people to build post offices and courthouses, but it also sponsored art projects and academic projects. So Susie R.C. Byrd was a Works Progress worker, and she was tasked with interviewing a group of people who were then called ex-slaves. So that's the term they were known by at the time, but we would call them formerly enslaved people. She interviewed a man named Alan Crawford, who at the time no longer lived in Southampton County, Virginia. He lived in North Emporia. In his interview, he very clearly locates his place of origin, noting the Southampton Rebellion. He says, "I was bred, born, and reared within 3 miles of Nat Turner's insurrection, the Travis Place." As a child in Southampton County, years after the rebellion, remember he's being interviewed in the 1930s, so he was not alive in 1831. He was really raised by a community of survivors. He was raised by older siblings and adults, and his grandmother, who had survived the rebellion. Really, through his interview, we learn a lot about his enslaved childhood. In his interview with Byrd, he recounted a basic narrative of the rebellion, that a group of men led by Nat Turner had met in late August 1831, after enjoying a barbecue of a stolen pig, had moved throughout the neighborhood where he grew up with the explicit goal of killing every white man, woman, and child in the community. He gave a brief anecdote about 2 enslaved women, who we'll revisit later in my talk. And he moved on to a central family story, the story that his family passed down to him, that really for them was the story of the Southampton Rebellion. His grandmother was enslaved on the Edwards Place, which is pictured here. You can see it sort of in the distance in this image from around 1900. As the story went, Nat Turner was brought upon his capture 2 months after the rebellion ended in late October 1831 to the Edwards Place on his way to the county seat for imprisonment and trial. And on his way through the Edwards Place, Alan Crawford's grandmother came out the front door, walked up to Nat Turner, and said to him, so as Alan Crawford recounts, Grandma ran out and struck Nat in the mouth, knocking the blood out, and asked him, "Why did you take my son away?" So for him, the story of the rebellion was not a triumphant story of revolution or freedom making, but the story of his grandmother's grief. His uncle very well could have been the Henry who initially followed Nat Turner. And his family ties were probably very, very close. I'll show you on the map just how close the Edwards place was to the place where Nat Turner was enslaved. But for him, the memory that was passed down through generations was a memory of caution, a memory of grief, and a memory of violence that's a little bit different than the kind of violence we're used to thinking about when we think about the Southampton Rebellion. His grandmother hit Nat Turner so hard that he started bleeding. So really, take a moment with that their family story, the story that this man is recounting in the late 1930s, over 100 years after the fact, that story is that Grandma smacked the mess out of Nat Turner for the grief of the county. My book actually takes place somewhere between his grandmother's hand and Nat Turner's face. I'm interested in exploring the lives of women like Crawford's grandmother, the ways that they both endured and survived slavery, and also the violence of the wake of the rebellion. One of the reasons that I wanted to focus on surviving in Southampton is because African American women were deeply involved in the everyday strategies of evasion and resistance of slavery and enslavers in the county. To give you a sense of the book, I begin by talking about what I call geographies of surveillance and control. So I talk about the long history in Virginia of developing a system of slavery, chattel slavery over time. I talk about the methods of control, or as the late historian Stephanie Camp would call them, containment. How white enslavers endeavored to control every moment of African American enslaved people's daily lives to benefit from their labor and extract labor from them. And then I also talk about the ways that for generations, African Americans in Southampton County had thwarted those geographies of surveillance and control, the systems that they had developed for a long time to thwart things like slave patrols, to thwart and pass information to each other during the working day. I then move on to talk about women, specifically enslaved women, and to talk about their position within households and individual plantations. I use their laboring lives as a source to demonstrate the ways that women actually had an access to a range of spaces on the types of small to mid-sized plantations that existed in Southampton County at the time. While we're used to thinking of enslaved men as the more mobile gender, that's true to an extent off of and outside of plantation boundaries. It's true enslaved men at times had access to skilled trades or types of labor like wagoning that required them to be mobile outside of plantations. But enslaved women on plantations of about the size that existed in Southampton County at the time had way more mobility within the plantation. I talk about the ways that women's work, both as domestic laborers and sometimes also as field laborers, could put them just about anywhere during a working day on a given plantation. And that gave them access to information and gave them access to critical sustenance and supplies. I talk a lot about free people in the book. Free people of color existed. They're the third highest population of free people of color in the Commonwealth of Virginia in the 1830s was in Southampton County. And they were often embedded in enslaved communities. I talk about them and their role in the rebellion. I also talk about enslaved children. We'll visit them a little bit later in the talk briefly, but I'm happy to answer questions about how enslaved and free children participated in the rebellion and what role in rebellion more broadly Black children played. And then I reread court documents at the end, and we'll talk a little bit about the sorts of things I do. Actually, again, playing with the term geography to sort of very literally look at the documents a little bit differently. Now, I know regionally where you all are today, you're probably very familiar with where Southampton County is, but I just want to orient us in the county a little bit and give a sense for the geography of the county that I'm talking about. So this is an antebellum map of Virginia, and Southampton County is right there on the border with North Carolina. And if we zoom in, this is the county, and it's at least its antebellum borders. Vanessa M County to the east no longer exists. The county is bisected by the Nottoway River, that is named for the original inhabitants of those lands. Today, descendant communities of those indigenous people go by two names, Nottoway and Shernahaка-Nottoway. Of course, indigenous people are keepers of their own histories, and so it is up to them how they would like to be referred to. I also mark off a place on this map called Indian Land that was still a sort of very small portion of a one-time reservation in Southampton County. Jerusalem, now Cortland, Virginia, was and is the county seat. And it is believed to be the location that Nat Turner was trying to reach because there's a cache of weapons there for local militia. They try to cross at Cypress Bridge after being thwarted at another bridge. They try to cross here to make it across the river from the southern half of the county to get to those weapons, and they're thwarted. Again, sort of by complete happenstance by militia coming over the bridge. If we were to zoom in even more on the map to give you a clearer idea of the route that insurgents took during the rebellion, it would look something like this. So this is the route from home to home in the neighborhood. I also wanted to include various swamps and historic roads so that readers could understand what roads insurgents were avoiding and what swamps they were using to navigate. Initially, the insurgents meet at Cabin Pond. Cabin Pond still exists. I actually was just there last week. I'll show you a picture in a moment. There's the Nottoway, and this is Cabin Pond. It, of course, is more like a swamp. It periodically sort of floods and drains, and actually is fed by a natural spring and well underneath. So they met at Cabin Pond and then began the rebellion at Joseph Travis's place, and that was the farm plantation where Nat Turner was enslaved. So they start with his enslavers and then make their way around to different individuals. This is an image of what's left of Cypress Bridge. The bridge was, of course, maintained over the years, but now it's out of commission. But it gives you sort of a sense of just how close they came. It's not so far a distance across the Nottoway River. That gray square is Peter Edwards' place. That's where Alan Crawford's grandmother was enslaved. And today we're going to talk about basically her neighbors. We're going to talk about folks at the Francis place, and we're going to talk about folks, one woman in particular at Richard Porter's place. So a lot of times when researching enslaved people, and particularly enslaved women, historians and archivists, we talk a lot about confronting silence in the archives, that we want to know information about enslaved women's lives, we want to know more about who they were as individuals, and we're just met with silence. We only get to see maybe dots or dashes on a ledger or a tax document. Sometimes we can't even get people's names, let alone traces of their voices. But in my work on the Southampton Rebellion, I had to learn how to trust silence. I got traces of enslaved women's voices, and I'll talk about how in just a moment. But I had to trust the moments where they were silent. And I want to be very clear that I'm not talking about moments where they were silenced, because that is also something I encounter, but moments where it's clear that they're consciously making the very savvy choice to remain silent. And to not expose members of their communities to further harm in the aftermath of the rebellion. I trust silence in the archive because silence was a useful weapon of resistance and evasion. Silence saved lives. Silence was a key tool that enslaved people used post-rebellion to shape their survival praxis. So this is an image of Richard Porter's house. The house itself, and actually when I was just back in the county, it's basically gone now. But in 2019, some of it was still standing or leaning. And you can tell even in its sort of dilapidated state here in the present day, that the Porters were doing all right for themselves in a two-story home. It's a classic Virginia structure that's sort of a mirror image of itself on either side of a main hallway. And Richard Porter did, in fact, qualify as a plantation owner according to tax records. At the time of the rebellion, he, in fact, enslaved 30 people and was head of a household of 47 persons, if you add white individuals to that number. And among what would have been considered a very substantial slave holding was a woman named Venus. So to reorient you on the map about where we're talking, that's Richard Porter's place right there, the little blue square. Venus is an important individual because she's actually the first enslaved woman to be deposed and to be asked to testify in the formal trials that took place post-rebellion. As soon as militia had really scattered Nat Turner's forces by the afternoon of August 23rd, 1831, wealthy, well-to-do white men stepped in. They did not want the militia and vigilante violence to take care of people suspected of rebellion. One of the reasons they didn't want that to happen is because were enslaved people killed while being pursued by militia, the militia was not accountable for those deaths, so they couldn't be brought up on charges of murder. And additionally, were there to be actual trials and due convictions delivered by a specific slave court, then the Commonwealth of Virginia was obligated to reimburse enslavers for lost property. So if an enslaved person were convicted of conspiring to rebel, sentenced to execution and executed, then the Commonwealth of Virginia would pay their enslaver an official valuation. The court would make an official valuation of an enslaved person, and they would have to pay that money to the enslaver. So fairly quickly, large people with large slaveholdings wanted to make sure the right sorts of white men were in charge, and were not only controlling the narrative of the rebellion, but were handling the issue of determining who should and shouldn't be punished for participation. Women like Venus have been overlooked by a number of historians. She's actually one of a group of women, white and Black, who end up testifying in these trials post-rebellion. And she's overlooked for the reason that she actually testifies for the prosecution. Now, as an enslaved woman, Venus doesn't have much of a choice of what side of whatever case she comes down on. She's certainly not volunteering herself to be deposed. So if the Commonwealth of Virginia demands that she testify, she cannot refuse. That's not something she can do. It is possible that she was testifying under duress. So she's in a very precarious position post-rebellion. So it's not really her choice to testify against someone. So that's something that needs to be in the front of your mind. As a historian, of course, seeing all these women pop up in these trial records, the first thing I asked was, if these white men who are wealthy, who care very much about making sure slavery stays the same, thought to ask enslaved Black women what had happened. Why haven't historians done that yet? Why haven't we asked Black women what exactly happened? So here's how I use Venus's testimony. All stories, of course, have a beginning, middle, and end. So post-rebellion, here's what I know about Venus. I know her name because it appears in the court record. I know that she provided testimony for the prosecution. And I can tell a little bit about her pre-rebellion life. I know she was enslaved by Richard Porter. And I can tell from a number of documents about his life what life may have been like for her on his particular plantation. But that leaves what exactly she was doing during the rebellion a huge question mark. So I know the basic demographics of the Porter place. And I also know that he, in that holding of 30 enslaved individuals, a significant number of those 30 individuals were children, which meant she was among a small number of adults expected to do all of the adult labor on the farm. Yes, children did smaller tasks, especially as they were being trained to do things like picking cotton that actually takes a fair amount of skill, so as not to be injured, or pulling tobacco, or raising corn, or basic animal husbandry tasks, for example. But it really fell on the adults to do the bulk of the labor, that she'd be expected to move seamlessly between domestic tasks with a number of domestic animals, potentially tending everything from kitchen gardens to orchards, to then helping out with the cotton and tobacco or corn harvest, all agricultural products that were planted and sown in Southampton County. This would have meant she'd have had mobility within that particular household, not really outside of the bounds of that plantation, but within the bounds of that plantation. She would have been able to move from space to space, and as a result, would have had access to information, key information. I use other sources in the book to talk about the ways that women are often passing information, sometimes through kitchens that were these hubs of activity at the time. Often their kitchens at the time are outbuildings. So basically every and anyone is coming through these spaces. But she would have had particular knowledge that men just would not have had access to, because there really was only one place that enslaved men were supposed to be during the working day. And at the time of year that this rebellion happened, at the end of August, that would have been in the fields. Now, Venus testifies that during the rebellion, yes, she was in the front yard of Richard Porter's place. Yes, she did meet the two men whose trial she's testifying in. They rode up on a horseback. They asked if rebels had been at the Porter place yet. And it's interesting because she sort of passively constructs how they get this next piece of information. She doesn't actually come out and say, I told them, yes. She says it was at the Porter place that they learned that rebels had already been there and they should go on after them. So here she is at a key hub of information, passing on key information to want-to-be insurgents, telling them, hey, the rebellion's been through here, and you need to keep going on up the road if you want to join up with it. Something she is silent about, and this is very important, she only answers questions she's asked, is that she doesn't actually talk about something that is evidenced in other documents. In Nat Turner's Jailhouse Confessions, almost 2 months later, he notes that he personally visited the Porter place. And that the Porter place was actually where he learned for the first time that whites in the county knew the rebellion was afoot. Which means not only did Jack and Andrew get critical information in the front yard of the Porter place where Venus was standing, So did Nat Turner. And critical information about having lost the element of surprise is incredibly important. You can't have a successful military operation without good intelligence. I often say in community talks that I give about the Southampton Rebellion that while men and boys may have been overwhelmingly the infantry and cavalry of this particular rebellion, Black women, time and again, appear as the intelligence network and the supply corps, two critical needs in any successful military operation. Both Venus and Nat Turner avoid mentioning any informants or naming any names. In fact, Turner doesn't name a single individual in his confessions who wasn't already tried and convicted. Again, silence saves lives. Silence is actually a strategic move. So here we have a way that one woman placed in a very particular domestic location is a hub of information. But what about women who didn't actually make it into the trial records? So we just talked about the Porter place. Now we're going to talk about the Peter Edwards's neighbors on the other side at the Francis place. The heat of a Southside August was kind to cotton and nothing else. The only other living things that looked forward to the heat were preachers. It was sitting in season for the white folk who could travel to revivals. They would wait on the Lord and wait for the king, King Cotton, to burst open, make his presence known, and demand more tribute in sweat and scars. The white fluffy wealth was all over the county. Some big men had vast fields, while many others had patches here and there. In the heat and the foggy haze of swampy humidity, the cotton no longer needed chopping. It just needed sun and water and time. Then the hardest season would come in a wave of bursting bowls. The cotton would open up and the hands would sweep it up and the gins would clean it up and the hands would mold it out and card it. But in August, the cotton would bide time and mature and the hands would spend less time in the fields and more time occupied elsewhere. For women like Charlotte, there was never an end to work, no matter what season it was. The cotton was just one thing growing. In the summer of 1831, for example, her new enslaver, Lavinia Francis, was close to welcoming her first child. Lavinia was only 18 at the time. Her young husband, Nathaniel Francis, brought his wife to his childhood home place from Northampton County, North Carolina, just over the border from Southampton County, Virginia. Lavinia took over as manager of the farm's domestic labor and laborers when Nathaniel's mother, who still lived on the place. With the new woman of the house came another new woman, Esther. An enslaved woman came along from North Carolina as a wedding gift, like a trunk or a trousseau. The heat could not have been easy on Lavinia in her condition. She'd grown up in the heat of the region just across the border, but that summer, she was sweating for two. The Francis family perhaps later recalled rebels arriving on their place in the morning, August 22nd, 1831, on the heels of a young boy they knew from the farm of neighboring kin. But the truth was that rebels had arrived much earlier than that. Francis's enslaved laborers, Sam and Will, were both original conspirators with Nat Turner, who, along with a small group of others, had plotted, at least since that spring, to foment rebellion in the neighborhood. Will had been in the Francis holding since the time of Nathaniel's father, Samuel Francis. The enslaved man Sam had arrived on the farm in the early 1820s. As one historian of the rebellion points out, quote, the holdings of Nathaniel and his sister together would produce 4 of 7 original insurgents, including the leader, his chief lieutenant, and the executioner. Ultimately, 6 men and boys from Nathaniel Francis's place, none of whom were recent arrivals to his holdings, traveled the county with rebels in August 1831. Lavinia Francis actually manages to survive the initial assault on the Francis place. An enslaved person from a neighboring farm runs her upstairs in the Francis home. Here's a close-up of the home. And at the time in 1831, they hadn't built the large addition on the left side of the screen. So to the left of that line is the new addition. To the right of that line would have been what existed for the Francises. So even though they're these sort of up and coming enslavers in the neighborhood, they're still living in a relatively small structure. This is an image from 1900 of the sort of upper room in that small structure. And that cubby hole on the side is where this enslaved person sort of shoved Lavinia Francis in there. It's so hot that she passes out from the heat, and she actually passes out between two rafters. So when slave rebels come through and they're searching the sort of attic cubby space for her, they can't find her because she's actually passed out in between the rafters. When she comes to later, she hears a commotion out back where the kitchen is, and she sort of, waddles down the steps to try and figure out what's going on outside. When she woke up, she made her way to the kitchen behind the house where she could hear Charlotte and Esther fighting. The three women regarded each other, and the following moments moved quickly. Charlotte grabbed a handy knife and lunged at Lavinia. Esther stepped between them and held off Charlotte, who just missed dispatching their enslaver. Lavinia grabbed a nearby wheel of cheese and fled to the woods. In the space of a few hours, Lavinia Francis had escaped death twice, once at the hands of enslaved men, at once at the other end of an enslaved woman's kitchen knife. Now, I think about, what's happening in that kitchen. And we know from oral histories of the rebellion that the two women are not just fighting over their enslavers' possessions. Possessions actually that Esther probably could very well have, ridden on top of that trunk of clothing that they were fighting over on her way to Southampton County, whether she wanted to be there or not. That, they're fighting over who should get this clothing, who should get these possessions, and they're also making dinner, reportedly. So they fully expect for these men to come back, and they fully expect to be feeding them. Something key to Esther's story is that often historians, treat these two women as a perfect binary, that Charlotte, if you read sort of earlier, more racist histories, Charlotte is evil, but Esther is loyal. Or if you read some more contemporary histories, Charlotte is a real freedom fighter, but Esther is in cahoots with the white power structure. And I argue in the book that no, actually, both of these women are participating in this rebellion. And Esther's very human line that for her, murdering a woman who's 8 months pregnant, that's just her sort of moral line. That's not something that she wants to happen. But she also doesn't help Lavinia Francis to safety. She just kind of gives her that few moments of grace to escape. She actually stays in that kitchen, and as far as we know, continues cooking. This is an image of Lavinia Francis years later, but that's what she looked like. She does go on to survive the rebellion. And she actually goes on to have the child that she's pregnant with at the time. And this is a page from their family Bible. And this line here where the arrow was pointing is where it was probably her, either her or her mother-in-law, wrote out the birth of her firstborn. It looks like this. And it reads, William Samuel Francis, son of Nathaniel Francis, and Lavinia Francis, his wife, was born 27th of September, 1831, 1 month, 7 days after insurrection. So the insurrection, the rebellion, is recorded in their family documents and linked to the birth of their child. Women like Charlotte and Esther, because they don't appear in court records, often don't end up appearing in official histories. But I have a lot of respect for Black oral history and for fragments of their history as they appear. Alan Crawford actually mentions them in his WPA narrative. Charlotte and Esther pop up in different texts that actually rely on oral histories. So it's really important for me to think about their position within a particular household and the ways that their space within the space of a kitchen becomes very important to the ways that Black women and women like them may have participated in this rebellion. Finally, I want to talk about a couple of ways that I look at geography and think about place and space as sources. So this is a map of what was then Jerusalem, but is now Cortland, Virginia. The jail where insurgents were held. Sometimes when we hear jail, we kind of immediately think of sort of modern day prison industrial complexes. But the jail, here's an image of the jail in 1900. It's actually a two-story wood-clad building. It had two large open cells, and that's it. So really, in this space is where about 50 enslaved people suspected of rebellion were being held. Any other time, if for any other circumstance, a gathering of 50 enslaved people downtown in the county seat would have been a reason to call out the militia. But here, white people are actually facilitating this space. So while the jail is obviously, it's the epicenter of containment, of oppression, it projects a particular kind of white power that is very real life and death power. People held in this jail are able to talk about what happened at their trial, talk about what they learned as they moved between the jailhouse and the courthouse each day, talk about what information white people now had, what information they didn't have. The county clerk's office is where trials were recorded. They didn't have modern court stenographers, so these are not verbatim accounts or documents that are written down by a county clerk from notes and from memory in very large minute books. And here's the courthouse. There is a structure, a brick structure that was put up actually a couple years after the rebellion on exactly the same place as the wooden building once was. And if you go to Cortland today, that's actually the same courthouse now. They're actually doing new renovations on the courthouse, but the original courthouse building is being preserved. And you can actually see the bars on the window on the side building over here. That's the current county jail. But also important to this geography of downtown Jerusalem is the hanging tree that in a modern day situation, you can actually still see the top of the courthouse, even though there are modern buildings there now. But individuals held in the jail very well could have seen the hanging tree from where they were being held. And rotating slightly to the right across the street from the location of where the hanging tree once was is the local Potter's Field. That's a burial ground both for indigent, destitute people and also people convicted of crimes, where most of the folks executed during the rebellion probably are buried. In all, the trials resulted in 18 executions, 12 transportations from the state. And then there are documented individuals who were killed at capture, 7 killed upon capture, 2 killed before capture, and around about 8 presumed killed from documentation. But anger, fear about the rebellion spread even into North Carolina and states far away. So we actually don't have a solid number of how many Black people were murdered in the wake of this rebellion. I want to look at the trial records and give you a sense of a different kind of geography. I will say these trials are very available. There's a transcribed, printed, bound book version of all of these cases. You can usually get the microfilm reels of these documents. I have looked at all possible versions. I've looked at the originals in Southampton County. I've looked at the microfilm versions at the Library of Virginia. I've looked at the transcribed copies. These books are almost table-sized documents. So they're very big. And they look a little bit like this. If you were to open up the book pages, you'd have one page on each side. And to give you a sense, I don't expect you to be able to read this from this image, but this is where a day at court begins in the book. And it's not actually until flipping the page, so really 2.5 pages of writing later, that the first trial concerning an enslaved person respected of rebellion pops up. So that means anything before that, so those 2.5 pages, that's just like other stuff that's happening at court that day. So if you only look at sort of disaggregated court cases, you only zoom in on, okay, this is just the case, and you ignore everything else that's happening that day, you miss things like this. A group of free people of color who came to court that day, who walked through that downtown, walked through what would have been a very crowded courtyard of white people hoping to see what they wanted, which is people sentenced to execution, finding more out about what had happened during the rebellion, walk through that to have their freedom written into the record. Free people of color had to register once a year by Virginia law, and time and again, they show up in groups of people to make sure their freedom is officially recorded. So here in the geography of a minute book page, directly juxtaposed with a trial that is supposed to be demonstrating the absolute power that whites have over Black lives. And in the case of the person on trial, they do have that power. Directly juxtaposed are people with reading their Black freedom into the record. One final thing that actually implicates both Black women and children are some of the activities that I see on the part of free people of color in and among the documents. So listed among all of those other things that are happening at court while these trials are going on. And one really good example is the indenture of Boyd Whitfield. And there are a few indentures scattered throughout, some after the fact, right after trials end. But his mother, Catherine Whitfield, appears at court to bind her son out and indenture him to a man named William Cutler. The indenture system, it's sort of based on the old apprentice system, based on the old indenture system. But for boys, it meant being bound to a white landowner until the age of 18, for girls until 21. It was used for white children too, so white children who ministers of the poor deemed their parents were unfit or couldn't take care of them, or they were orphans. But white children were guaranteed basic education and a small sum of money at the end of their indenture. Right after trials from the rebellion end, the Byrds show up at court to bind out all of their children. It's actually a large group of children who are between the ages of 5 and 11 years old. And they bind out their children to a man named Benjamin Whitfield. This is a really exploitative labor system. It mostly takes away really key laboring years. It was often used in abusive ways to take free children away from their parents so that white people could have access to that labor. And so I kind of scratched my head and thought, well, why would these parents voluntarily be doing this? You know, they're not being forced to give their children up. Why would they do this? At the time that they're binding their children out, the Virginia legislature is debating expelling free people of color from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so this is one way, by anchoring their children to a white household, it's one way to absolutely keep them in the county. As adults, they probably themselves had year-long labor contracts, and they were actually trying to keep their families together. When I did some research on both of the men that these families are binding their children to, neither of them actually held any enslaved people at the time. Both had free people of color counted within their households. And one is actually the descendant of a prominent Revolutionary era enslaver who freed all of his enslaved people in his will. So they're being very selective about who these white men will be, and trying to use what is a very exploitative system for the one sort of advantage it had, which was keeping their children and their families close. Again, survival was labor. I want to end closer to the present day and in the present day county. Today, Nat Turner's descendants actually own the land where he was once enslaved. They purchased it in the early 20th century. I'm at the edge of a field along a gravel road that leads to Cabin Pond. His descendants now display this sign, a marker of their own. In it, they commemorate a few different things. They commemorate their ancestor, Nathaniel Nat Turner, a literate minister, slave, and leader of the Southampton slave insurrection of August 21st, 1831, hid in caves near this site until his capture on October 30th, 1831. The first sign had been shot through, so the county actually replaced it, but this picture from 2019, you can see that the first pot shot has already been taken in the sign. Something that I notice about this sign is that they're not just commemorating, their ancestor for leading a rebellion. They're also commemorating the fact that he managed to stay hidden for 2 months, actually fairly near where he had once been enslaved. This past year, 2021, was the 190th anniversary of the rebellion. And so in a Twitter thread, you can find it on the hashtag Surviving Southampton. You can find it through my handle on Twitter. I'm actually basically live tweeting the rebellion day by day, including his entire time as a fugitive, an outlier in Southampton County. This project began as an undergraduate honors thesis, and the first question I ever had about Nat Turner's rebellion, reading his jailhouse confessions, was about this long time period that he remained a fugitive in the county. He could not farm his own food, he could not hunt, he couldn't risk being seen. And so my first question was, how did he eat? And while I don't have, one name of one person who fed him, it has become clearer and clearer to me over time that he ate because he had community. So here I am with Bruce Turner, one of Turner's descendants, in 2019, and I just got to see Bruce again this past week. We were filming for a project. Here he is at a church where Nat Turner once preached. Of course, he didn't preach within the building. He preached outside of the building in the back. In February of 2021, after years of community activism and pressure from the local Black community, Blackhead Signpost Blackhead Signpost Road has finally become history, and not the Green Street sign commemorating the space. That guy in the red jacket in this image, he's actually the descendant of Lavinia Francis, who you met a couple of slides back. Rick Francis is now the county clerk in charge of all the records in Southampton County, and he would not exist had Lavinia Francis not been given that couple of seconds of grace by Esther in 1831. So here's where Blackhead Signpost was, and this is the road that was named Blackhead Signpost. Something that I want to highlight is that along with getting the street name changed, through local advocacy, Blackhead Signpost Road is now an official historic marker, officially making that violence both commemorated and recognized as violence in the way that African Americans in the county want it to be. And here's an image of the new Signpost Road. This is the new street sign. So that preserves the history of the name of the road while making sure that violence against Black bodies is not being glorified. Enslaved and free Black people were incredibly savvy post-rebellion. There's a way in which the county's never not surviving the rebellion, and African Americans in the county are still advocating and enacting practices of survival right up until the very, very present day. After Turner's capture in October of 1831 and his execution in mid-November, whites tried to return to normal, declaring that the rebellion was over. But for Southampton, the rebellion lingered on. Whites remained on high alert, and African Americans continued to adapt their resistance to new vigilance on the part of whites. Alan Crawford, who we began with, as an elderly man, could recite Southampton's detailed slave patrol schedule from his post-rebellion childhood from memory. Until this past February, or I guess now February 2021, you could drive down a road that was still named Blackhead Signpost Road. And with that present day reflection, I'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Holden. I was riveted, and I know that our audience was as well. So I'm going to start with the questions that were first in the chat, and then we'll get to the others. So our very first question is from Veronica Downing, who is an African-American women's history with me this semester. My question is regarding Charlotte and Esther in chapter 2. The story states that during the rebellion, these two women, before fighting over their mistress's things, made dinner for the men to return to. What gave them the confidence of knowing that their men would return from this rebellion alive?
So this is one of those, right, silences in the record that, I can't speak individually to what they were necessarily feeling or what led them to the decisions that they made. But I can speak to the longer evidence of individuals participating in resistive action. And some of the most popular form of resistance was truancy, was people lying out, as they called it. And that could be absences from, a couple of days to years outlying. Southampton County is relatively close to the Great Dismal Swamp. And there are a number of swamps, that dot the county. And Sylviane Diop's book about maroon communities in the United States talks a lot about that region that straddles Carolina and Virginia. But African American communities outside of those spaces of outlying were often supplying people in the swamps or helping them when they could. So I do also talk about the ways that women are crucial to this. So to some extent, Charlotte and Esther were doing what women had to do anyway. It was a time in which, cooking dinner was actually a well thought out all day process, that you didn't just start dinner 15 minutes before you wanted to have it. You were cooking most likely over an open hearth. You were cooking, so you had to plan out. If you wanted bread for dinner, that's something you have to start hours, before, maybe even the day before. If you want peas for the week, you better start boiling them, that morning or the morning before to get there. Right? You better go to the smokehouse and, see what you have left by this time in the year. You better dig out, what's left in the root cellar and go look at the garden to see what you have. So in some ways, right, people are going to have to eat, whether these men come back or not. And dinner is an all day process. And so for them, right, this is a contribution that fits right in with the kind of labor that they're already having to do. They also just had watched 7 white people get murdered in their front lawn. So when insurgents came through, they did not look like they were going to be on the losing side. And those bodies were still there. They were just out in the front yard in the August heat. So they, basically went about their business. And that business, right, was to feed people.
Absolutely. Thank you. So the next question, and before I say that, folks, if you have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. So the next question is from Brianna James. My question is, were there any African Americans enslaved and free that did not like Nat Turner during this time? And that's actually similar to a question I had when thinking about that quote you started with. So ambivalence and negative feelings about the rebellion by Black survivors and descendants at that moment, and then through moving us forward into the present moment.
So it's interesting. It's complicated, right? So on the one hand, Turner does become a folk hero. Like there's so much wrapped up in that name, Nat Turner, that is nothing to do with the actual historical person. It has to do with like white people's imaginations of some evil, menacing, always hyper violent Black man in the shadows, and African Americans championing and turning him into a folk hero. There's actually a phrase in Virginia, it's all over the WPA narratives, sharp enough to get by old Nat, that Black people would, in the Jim Crow era, they would be slighted by whites or assumed to be less intelligent, and they would just kind of say under their breath, this person's smart, but not smart enough to get by old Nat. That, they don't actually really see us. They don't really know us. So there's that way that he becomes this folk hero. But a lot of what I talk about in the book is the kind of messy community piece of this, which is that ultimately a lot of Black people ended up dead. A lot of mothers lost sons. A lot of children lost fathers. People were transported from the state, which is just another kind of death. There's a huge exodus of free people of color. There's a huge group of folks who go to Liberia from Southampton County in the wake of the rebellion. Those people are often connected through kinship to enslaved Black people. So it is, surviving it was labor and was work. And I think it says a lot that Crawford's family memory is not, so we want you to grow up to be like Nat Turner. It was, here's how you survive. Here's how you're going to survive this. And honestly, Nat Turner was executed, and Crawford's grandmother had a grandson in the 1930s talking to a government worker who was very much alive and had lived a full life, right? So whose strategies won out in the end? I also think, I talked to Bruce Turner about this in the county, driving around with him. He's a lovely gentleman who is just full of stories and family stories. And he said growing up, his family would warn him not to get mixed up in any Turner mess, which is what they call it, because that's how you die. I mean, enslaved people were very, very clear that, large scale violent rebellion, there's literally only one place that ends. And so it says something that these individuals were like, this is it. But it's much more complicated than just celebrated freedom fighter or race traitor, that there's only those two things and that's it. So there are people like Alan Crawford's grandmother who are got to bring in a cotton harvest with like 18 able-bodied men dead, right? They're feeling that empty space in the rows. Cotton harvest is no joke. And Southampton County cotton at the time was, it's very rare that you can grow cotton in Virginia. So this is like very niche type of cotton that could grow there. And enslaved people, I use a quote in the book, they talk about it as like kind of scrawny and like it was hard to pick because it was covered in sap. Today, modern cotton, they're growing cotton in the county again. Modern cotton, cotton is cotton is cotton. Monsanto has made sure that, crops are standardized. But at the time, that didn't exist. You got the crop that could survive the environment you were in. So these women now are left to pick up the pieces. And not surprisingly, not super excited about that.
The chapter that we've been focused on in terms of theorizing Black women's history is in A Shining Thread of Hope is survival and other forms of resistance, and really contemplating what that means. Is survival a form of resistance? And if so, how? And that's a question that they've been kind of contemplating from the moment of arrival through the Civil War. So Dr. Nicole Lewis asks, she's really interested by the geography, and actually before even I give her question, she mentions that she has driven by one of the homes multiple times, the one that's a ruin now, on her way to Emporia. So again, and I've got a comment in my group chat from the young man who I mentioned who fishes all the time, and this is just all very tender to us here. So she asks, is the original jailhouse anywhere near the current Southampton County prison, I wonder?
So there is like a county jail roughly in the same area now, but the prison I think you're talking about, no, they're not in the same area. Though that prison, there was a prison break, I think, in the late 20th century, very famous prison break, led by a Turner, one of
A Turner.
one of the
Wow.
family. Yeah, so the Turners, they have this like family thing where they're like, of course, not everyone with the last name Turner in the region is related to Nat Turner. It's a very common last name, but yeah. So no, they're not exactly the same. But yeah, the legacy of the prison industrial complex and containment is right there in Southampton County.
Absolutely. Just down the road from where we are is our county prison, and right in the swamp, frankly. So did you purposely want to project your woman on the front? So the book image displaying hope and resilience in her eyes, body, and nonverbal body language. So let's talk art, because I was also entranced by some of the way that you have made the maps and other images your own. So they're not just coming straight from the archive, but they've been also modified.
Yeah, so let me actually share this. So in the midst of writing the book, I had the opportunity to go to Baltimore to do a panel for someone else's book. And I went to an exhibit at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and Stephen Towns, who is an artist based in Baltimore, had a show up of story quilts. He taught himself how to quilt. He's originally from South Carolina. He taught himself how to quilt. And he did a number of quilts that tell the story of the rebellion. But this quilt, Special Child, caught my eye, and he really he was highlighting the community, and he was highlighting women. And I felt like, there are a lot of images of Nat Turner, a lot of artist renderings of Nat Turner. It was the first time that I was seeing an artist working with the rebellion in the way that I saw it as a historian. Like, it was like he was doing what artists can do imaginatively, things I couldn't do with documents, but it was in such alignment. So I was at my panel that evening, and there was a man in the front row who just like was furiously scribbling notes, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, hey, hi." He's very shy. "Hi, I'm Stephen. I'm really excited for your book." And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah, I just did this, like, I just did a project about the rebellion. I made some quilts." And I was like, "Excuse me?" It was like, oh my gosh, you're Stephen Towns. I just saw your work. It's so amazing. I'd love to use it on the cover of my book. And he was very excited about that idea. So originally I wanted this quilt, which he said could be either Turner's grandmother or mother. Turner actually begins his own narrative with his family and the what Dinah Barry would call soul value that his family imbued in him, and begins with these two women, his grandmother in particular. So I was like, I really want this, on the cover of my book. But unfortunately, it doesn't read very well in 2 dimensions. You can't see the rich detail of his work that way. So the marketing team at Illinois looked at another series that he's done called the Black Magic series. And in it, he's imagining the lives of Nat Turner and Cherry Turner, his wife. And this actually ended up being a really lovely nod to Cherry Turner, who comes up in the book and she comes up in the book in that we know she existed, and there's so much more there that I wished we knew, but silence, and I think strategically, silence has kept her hidden to everyone but her descendants. So this, the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. It's from Ecclesiastes. Um, uh, is the painting that is now the cover of the book. And he works in the series with a lot of the vocabulary of like church iconography. So the halo is an obvious motif. The butterflies are a motif throughout his work. But of course, saints, if you're ever in a Catholic church, what saints are holding and where they're set is very important because it's supposed to tell a story about the saint and how they became sainted. So she's holding a baby and a broken chain, and you can see both Cotton and the community behind her. So all of those symbols come together in a really lovely nod, at least for me, to not just Cherry Turner, but all the women whose names we'll never know, and who will never appear in documents, but raised consistent, generation after generation of Black children in Southampton County.
Thank you. So we've got 3 more, which is wonderful, in the Q&A. From Dr. Lewis again, you mentioned an adjacent record about freed Blacks registering each year. What did you find out in terms of what would happen if they did not register? Fascinating that during the time of the trials, that small group pressed through that crowd to re-register their freedom.
So by Virginia law at the time, free people of color had to register. It takes a precedent from a much older town practice that actually isn't related to slavery at all. That is related to controlling vagrants and vagrancy. And actually laws developed to police poor white people. Those same laws actually go on to become the vagrancy laws of the Reconstruction era. But in order to control what whites felt was a very troublesome population, an oxymoron even, that there could be a free Black person, they required registry in a particular county to basically constrict free people's movement. So you weren't allowed to work outside of your home county. And you had to register and pay a fee of registration every year. Or you could become indebted to the county and sometimes bound out against your will, or return to slavery in some cases for debt. So the consequences were steep. And in a very cash poor economy where people are often bound out and they're really getting room and board, their material conditions are very close to enslaved people. There's no like free enclave. There are very few Black landowners. So there are some very few Black landowners in Southampton in the antebellum period. That's not true now. Now there are many, many Black landowners in Southampton County, but that's a product of post-emancipation. That's not an antebellum thing. The closest to a free person of color enclave is in the Indian reservation. That's only because Indigenous people were considered free people of color. So you have to be very careful in the records because that term can mean people of Indigenous descent or African American or African descent. And of course, there are a number of people who are the same people who are both Indigenous and African, so Afro-Indigenous. So the consequences were pretty steep: imprisonment, potential re-enslavement, or at least indenture. And Southampton County does have extant a number of free person of color registries. There's actually a specific document that is a registry, and those are at the Library of Virginia in their special collections. In the court minutes, you can see anytime an individual appears, and it's all over the time of the trials. People are showing up. There was a call for a census of free people of color. So some of them are probably answering that call. But other people are showing up to get new copies of their free papers, which is not exactly the same thing, because they've lost their free papers. So you basically see this kind of, and often in groups, for obvious reasons, in groups, scramble to demonstrate freedom, make sure that they're accounted for in the county because they don't want to be expelled.
The the word census just really struck me there. I work with census material a lot and think of it so much as the door to door, but the way you described it as a call, and folks going to be counted really brings back the powerful biblical motifs that are, infused in all of this particular story from Turner himself. And it just really just kind of strikes the heart to think of folks coming to be counted and being put on the record, and making that movement themselves, out of necessity, being called to be counted. Um, so we have another set of questions coming up in the Q&A. One is from Adam Brothers. My question is, what were some of the after effects of the rebellion that had an impact on Black women during the time?
So there's the expulsion or execution of individuals. There are a handful of free people of color who are interviewed, but they have to be tried by a higher court. So there is a waiting for those trials to happen in the spring of 1832. There are a couple executions that result from those trials. So there's just kind of constant, ever-present public violence happening. So it's just sort of this kind of constant thing. The most immediate consequence is the loss of family and kin in kinship networks. And then kind of combined with that is the loss of overwhelmingly of men. There's only one woman who's tried and executed for participation in the rebellion. The loss overwhelmingly of men of prime working age in agricultural production. So women are now having to take up and bear the brunt of harvest, under increasingly watchful, repressive, violent eyes. The widespread, broad effect of the rebellion. It is a rebellion that shakes the slave South. There is vigilante violence all over the South. Famously, Harriet Jacobs talks about it in Edenton, North Carolina. There are sort of outbursts of violence against Black people, particularly free people of color all over, people who are known to be preachers. And then there are these debates in Virginia about possibly, phasing out slavery. Spoiler alert, they keep slavery. They don't get rid of it, but they try to get rid of free people. They try to expel them. There's in the county now, people still refer to it as the rebellion. Like it happened past August. And I think that that's really key. It's very present. In fact, most of the street signs in that half of the county are named for significant rebellion locations. Some structures that were there in 1830, still 190 years later, pieces of them are there still, or full structures are there still. There are little memorializations. A whole schoolyard of children is murdered during this rebellion. So there's still trees that have been planted and replanted to commemorate those children. There are these things that mark the landscape that if you're from there, you know what that is. But if you're not, you just kind of drive past it. Or you don't so it's Cabin Pond Road. If you don't know about the rebellion, why would you take note of that? So there's a sort of generations long historic memory and survival of this rebellion. And so I think that's also important to note. And it's often women who are keeping these stories and passing them on. Two of Nat Turner's descendants, both women, publish articles about their famous ancestors in what was then called the Journal of Negro History and is now the Journal of African American History. They published on the 40s. So again, it's women in the family. Bruce Turner, who I was just with in Southampton County, he learned from his grandmother and then did his own research, right? So there's these kind of, women are also like keepers of these events, and they keep pieces of it close because it's a very dangerous business.
So we've got another question. Actually, before I do Veronica's question, let's bring in a new person. Ajane Willis, who is a former ECSU student who is now a PhD student working towards candidacy in Texas. Following your theorization of survival as labor in Southampton, how then would you define the community building practices of this particular community or this group of ancestors?
So one historian of the rebellion has called it an intimate rebellion. And another historian of the rebellion, David F. Almendinger, did a lot of work on white families in the county and their enslaving practices. And I bring them both up because one of the things that comes out of Almendinger's work is the ways that enslavers in that county were very much cognizant of and benefiting from using enslaved people as financial products. So not just for their labor, but using the transfer of enslaved people in between different family members, actually in the neighborhood where this rebellion took place, as a way to shore up future generations' prospects. They were very consciously moving enslaved people between these farms, moving them around between groups of descendants, specifically to affect the financial futures of their families. And so enslaved people are building out community and fostering community in an environment where they are very much cognizant of how they're being commodified. Like it's not they're very clear that people are moving them not just for their labor, but because they want better financial futures. And one of the reasons it was really important for me to have maps made that talked about geographic features and showed where historical roads were is to give a sense of how well enslaved people had to know this neighborhood and this map in the dark without using the roads that white people built and would be on. That familiarity, that ability to move in between spaces and connect farms was essential because these white enslavers had chopped up their families and scattered them among, different siblings or different people. So what we're really looking at, right, in this group of men who meet at Cabin Pond are people who are related by marriage, are people who have been on the Travis Place in and out because they have kin there. We're looking at people who are very aware how dangerous the internal slave trade is and the lure of the internal slave trade is for their children. And it brings to light why they decide to kill everybody, that they murder infants, they murder small children because they don't want them to grow up to inherit them. So the intimacy of the rebellion, I actually think, is mostly coming from the Black side of the color line, that they know these enslavers. They grew up with some of these enslavers. Some of them live in the same buildings with them because they don't have separate slave quarters. Everybody's sleeping in the same house or in a kitchen. So the way that I'm thinking about Black community and their community building practices is more directly resistive Then, oh, let's look at individual holdings. Okay, that those people are a community. It's like, no, we need to think through what Almendinger has uncovered about who's been transferred from where at what time. Who do they know at this next location? Is it their sister? Is it their wife? Is it somebody that they're not allowed to get married to? That sort of pulls together, oh, they all know these locations incredibly well. And they know these enslavers incredibly well. Meanwhile, these enslavers are, it takes them a very long time to catch on that it's a slave rebellion. There's like some people who think it's the British. It's a lot. Like, it's the cognitive dissonance is really galling. But that's how they got. The militia won out in the end, but almost 60 of them were dead by that time.
Wow. I want to thank you so very much, Dr. Holden. Again, I think we could do this all day with you. And
Oh, I
we,
could talk about this. I have so much to say about all this. Yeah.
yeah,
When you
and
get
Chaz
when
and
the
I,
kids are in on it too, you're like, oh, wow, it really
yeah,
was
that's
everybody.
exactly right. And Chaz and I are already plotting on I'm bringing you here. And maybe that's a visit where we can actually get out into our swamp and this side of it, and and the geographies of here. I think that for many of us who are coming from rural places, those large gates to ruins of plantations are very provocative and profound. My people are on a dirt road in South Carolina, and we drive by those kinds of gates every day, right? So those are all powerfully meaningful to us. And again, the map we're making at Eaton today, with the courthouse and the jailhouse, and instead of the lawyer's office, there was the doctor's office, right? Like all of those spaces, the intimacy of the urban slavery and landscape, and you've shown us now the intimacy of the rural as well. So I really just want to thank you so much for your time. The students I know, and the rest of my colleagues and folks at ECSU and Elizabeth City are so grateful. Feel free in the chat, because we do save the chats, to say thanks, or if Chaz wants to bring everybody on as a panelist so you can see who you've been talking to this whole time, we can do that too. But I just want to thank you so much for your time. We've enjoyed this deeply and are excited to continue the conversation.
It's so exciting to talk to a crowd who knows where I'm talking about. I usually have to do a lot more orienting and description, but I know many of you know where this is, or you've been through there on your way up to Richmond or Petersburg or wherever. I just, if any, if I have a last word to say, it's that, Southampton knows this history and Southampton remembers. And there are Black people in Southampton, and have been have been for a minute, and they are keeping their own history and doing incredible heavy lifting, to bring that history to the forefront in the way that they want. And I think that that's incredibly important, to acknowledge, because it's not that nobody knows, right? It's who gets listened to. And so as much as I can, I will always foreground local efforts.
I don't know what else to say besides amen. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.